Last week, I experienced the most severe case of cultural whiplash of my life. I started my morning on the Chuo line in Tokyo during peak rush hour. And you have to imagine being physically crushed against hundreds of strangers, bodies packed so tight you can't even move your arms. Yet the silence was absolute. It was heavy. At one point, a businessman next to me sneezed, just this tiny, stifled sound, and he immediately bowed his head in a silent apology to the entire carriage. No phone calls, no eye contact, just this intense collective effort to be invisible. It felt like a machine where the supreme rule was, do not exist more than necessary. But then I got on a plane. And less than 20 hours later, I was standing in the middle of a market square in Marrakech. The contrast wasn't just a shift, it was a collision. Suddenly, order wasn't about silence, it was about volume. A moped driver zoomed inches from my leg, shouting something at a vendor who shouted back, and they both just laughed. Cars weren't following painted lanes, they were negotiating space through, aggressive eye contact and the rhythmic, almost musical blasting of horns. My first instinct was to tense up, to see this as pure anarchy compared to the morning's precision. But as I stood there watching this swirling traffic weave together without a single collision, I realized I was looking at it all wrong. The chaos wasn't a lack of rules, it was just a completely different language. In Japan, order is a wall you don't touch. Here, order is a dance you have to join. And that forced me to ask a question I hadn't considered before. If both of these opposite worlds function perfectly, what does order actually mean?
That cultural whiplash you just described, moving from the crushing silence of the Chu line to the loud, negotiated dynamism of the souk, that is the absolute core of our deep dive today.
Right. It's a central question.
It is. We're not looking for some single universal law of order because your experience proves that the concept itself is completely relative.
It has to be.
So our mission is really to decode the distinct cultural operating systems that define successful coexistence in these environments that are both hyperdense and, increasingly hyperdiverse.
So we're moving past the simple idea that order just means rules and quiet.
Exactly. We're going to prove that order is a profound product of culture, and we're focusing on two contrasting models. First, systems built on distance and self-restraint, which we see, perfectly exemplified in Japan.
Okay.
And second, systems built on interaction and perpetual negotiation, which defines so much of successful life in many North African cities.
Let's start there then. Let's unpack that order of distance. Japan is, it's often held up as the global paradigm for public composure and efficiency.
It is.
The immediate feeling for any visitor is this intense paradox. You're physically closer to strangers than almost anywhere else on Earth.
Literally body to body during rush hour.
Exactly. But you feel socially further away than ever. The public space is just governed by this consensus of, maximal self-restraint.
And the foundational philosophy behind that pervasive public silence is all about the collective protection of shared space.
Okay, so it's a group effort.
It's not about being timid or withdrawn. It's rooted in these profound cultural values of harmony, which they call wa.
Why?
Right. And consideration, omayari, and a really strong sense of social embeddedness. The social contract is basically, my individual expression is secondary to the smooth functioning and tranquility of the collective.
My existence must not impinge upon your peace.
That's it perfectly.
That sounds beautiful in theory. But as you mentioned, maintaining that level of communal peace, it must extract a massive psychological tax from the individual.
Yeah.
Where does that burden of performance go?
It goes directly into the individual psyche. It creates this internalized, ever-present pressure.
Right.
And we can see the immediate visceral weight of this expectation in the story of Kenji, a software engineer in Tokyo.
Okay.
He was on the packed Tozai line. And that's a notorious line. It often runs at 180% capacity. And the carriage was just silent except for the low rumble of the train.
I can picture it.
And Kenji felt a tickle in his throat, a sudden, an uncontrollable urge to cough. He described a rising panic, almost a physical terror, because breaking that heavy collective silence would shatter the wa.
Wow.
He fought it, physically stifling the cough until his eyes were tearing up. And his terror wasn't rooted in the fear of spreading germs. It was the certainty of facing the collective judgmental glare of annoyance from the hundreds of people around him.
Just for coughing?
Just for making a sound that disturbed their peace.
That is a staggering level of internalized control. We are talking about basic human physiology. A cough, a sneeze, being viewed as a social transgression. What are the long-term societal consequences when that level of social suppression is required just to ride the train?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, this hyper-order ensures miraculous logistical flow.
Right. The trains are punctual to the second, crime is low.
Public spaces are immaculate. But on the other hand, it creates what we really have to call a pressure cooker for the individual psyche.
That's a great term for it.
The individual is constantly performing this public face, which we'll get to, constantly policing their own actions. And this environment, while orderly, can lead to some severe stress and isolation.
And crucially, it has to affect more than just mental health. I mean, it must influence decision-making and innovation too, right?
How so?
Well, if the collective harmony requires an agreement, even a silent one, the individual who feels the need to offer critical dissent or propose a radical, disruptive idea, the person who coughs in the meeting, is inherently fighting against that deeply embedded cultural value of wa.
That is an excellent point. The system is exquisitely designed for optimization and precision within existing parameters, but it naturally resists radical deviation.
It has to.
If your goal is to maintain that delicate, pre-agreed social equilibrium, then challenging the consensus, verbally or behaviorally, it's dangerous.
So you need release valves.
This necessity creates release valves. We see it in the high rates of solitary consumption and private escapes.
Yeah.
The individual needs to find somewhere a tiny, anonymous izakaya bar where they can drink alone until 2 a.m., or a private activity just to feel allowed to breathe, to exist, or even make a sound without that crushing weight of collective expectation.
So that public self is so rigorously controlled that the private self demands total anonymity just to recover. So this intense public pressure, it forces the adoption of these complex social structures and even physical mechanisms to protect the vulnerable individual self.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the physical manifestation first. Mask dependency. We saw a huge rise globally during the pandemic, but in Japan, it's always been culturally present. And now it functions beyond just health protection.
Absolutely. The mask functions as a crucial psychological crutch for anonymity. When you wear a mask, you are literally obscuring the very part of your body, the mouth and lower face, that conveys emotion and social signals.
You're hiding in plain sight.
You're hiding in plain sight. It reduces the intense pressure to constantly perform social vigilance and group conformity. It allows you to be an anonymous cog, reducing that psychological burden of group performance. It's a quick, affordable way to build a fortress around yourself in public.
And the market has responded to this need for personal containment with dedicated infrastructure. We're seeing a boom in these one-man services.
These are profound physical manifestations of the desire for a contained personal space. The rise of solo yakiniku.
That's grilling your own meat alone, right?
Right, in your own little booth. Or solo karaoke rooms. Or even private segmented seating in ramen shops. They're not just quirky trends, they are architectural responses to the deep cultural necessity for a personal cocoon.
A cocoon, I like that.
These spaces offer momentary freedom from the intense scrutiny of the group, a place where the individual can drop their public face without fear of social consequence.
This brings us to the core mechanism governing Japanese interaction. The duality of Tatame versus Hon. We hear these terms a lot, but how does this duality actively govern daily life and communication?
Okay, so Tatame is the public facade, the surface behavior, which always prioritizes social equilibrium, harmony, and avoiding direct, unpleasant confrontation.
The polite face.
The polite face. And Han is the individual's true feelings, their desires, their intentions. The entire system is structured to ensure Tatame rules the public sphere, which often means communication is indirect, nuanced, and frequently relies on the unspoken.
Okay, so give us an example of how that subtle communication works, particularly in a high-stakes professional setting.
Let's take a business meeting. A supervisor might be deeply unhappy with a subordinate's project. Now, he can't just say, "This is terrible, redo it," because that shatters the wa and causes severe embarrassment.
Right, that would be a huge social misstep.
A huge one. Instead, he might smile warmly, offer a non-committal phrase like, "This was a good first effort. Thank you for your commitment." That's the Tatame.
Okay, the surface level.
But then he might follow up with an ambiguous instruction like, "Perhaps we can consider a more comprehensive approach next time."
So the subordinate is just to read between the lines.
The subordinate, operating within the cultural script, understands that the manager's reluctance to provide specific praise is the true Han. It means this is unacceptable and must be completely revised.
Wow. So the lack of explicit enthusiasm carries more actionable weight than the pleasant spoken word.
Exactly. This forces everyone to be highly skilled at reading the air.
That sounds exhausting. requiring constant interpretation. And I imagine that interpretation is further complicated by the fundamental social distinction of Uchi-soto.
The Uchi-soto system is, well, it's the genius and the complexity of Japanese social reality. It defines the distinction between the in-group, Uchi, and the out-group, Soto.
In-group and out-group.
But what makes it so difficult for outsiders is that these groups are fluid, they're constantly shifting based on context. You are never simply Uchi or Soto permanently.
So the boundary moves.
Precisely. If you are a sales representative talking to a colleague in the office, your colleague is your Uchi, your in-group.
Got it.
But when you meet a demanding client from an entirely separate firm, suddenly your relationship with that colleague changes. Your entire company, from the CEO down to the janitor, instantly becomes your Uchi.
And the client is the out-group.
The client and their company become the Soto. The goal is always to present a unified, humble front to the out-group, even if you are fighting internally.
And this movement dictates the very language you use. It formalizes status and humility through the extensive use of kaigo, the honorific language.
Kaigo is the linguistic engine that drives this constant social navigation. And it's not just about adding san to someone's name. It involves entirely different conjugations of verbs, specialized vocabulary, and complex grammatical structures that change based on the relationship between everyone involved.
What's the daily operational friction of navigating kaigo? What does that feel like?
It creates a tremendous cognitive load for employees. You use humble forms conjugo to refer to yourself or your in-group when speaking to an out-group member. You're effectively lowering your status to honor the listener.
Okay.
Conversely, you use respectful forms, sankaigo, to refer to a superior or someone in the out-group. And if you make a mistake, if you forget to use the humble verb form when referring to your own company's actions while speaking to a client, you've committed a social blunder.
So it's not just a grammar mistake.
It's not just a grammar mistake. You haven't just used the wrong word. You have signaled inappropriate arrogance, or even worse, a lack of social understanding. The communication becomes less about the content and more about correctly performing the relational status. It is a minefield that requires constant, cautious navigation.
It sounds like the culture requires a hypersensitivity to one's own presence, which is codified in that less tangible yet hugely powerful social control mechanism, mewaku kuenken.
Mewaku kuenken. It translates loosely to the prohibition of annoying or confusing behavior.
Confusing behavior, that's so vague.
And its true power lies not in a specific rule book, but in its very ambiguity. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's an appeal to the collective desire to avoid being a nuisance.
I see.
Because the definition of confusing behavior is so vague and context-dependent, it forces constant, almost paranoid self-monitoring. Every action is scrutinized. Am I standing in the way? Is my voice too loud? Am I asking a question that requires too much of the group's time?
So it's an incredibly effective mechanism for maintaining order because it taps into that deep cultural aversion to causing trouble.
Exactly. It ensures everyone acts cautiously and anticipates the needs of others.
We've established that the external world, the train, the office, the street, is a fortress of self-control, built on masks and carefully constructed language. So let's revisit that traveler in the hot spring lobby, masked and cloaked. What happens when she steps into the onsen, the communal hot bath? How can a culture that demands so much distance suddenly mandate total physical vulnerability?
This is perhaps the most profound cultural mechanism for managing the immense psychological pressure we just discussed. The onsen is a necessary cultural paradox.
A paradox.
In the single, highly ritualized space, nudity is mandated, and with that physical nakedness, all the layers of Tatame and social hierarchy are temporarily stripped away. The rules of public presentation are suspended. They're not merely paused, they're rewritten by the ritual.
It's so ironic. In the only public space where you are physically exposed, you feel psychologically free from the burden of scrutiny and social performance.
It is a critical release. The shared vulnerability of being nude in the steam, often surrounded by people of varying ages and statuses, it temporarily dissolves the stringent Uchi-soto divisions and the need for kaigo.
So for a moment, everyone is equal.
For a brief period, you are simply a person seeking purification and relief. The collective sigh of relief is almost palpable. This shared temporary lapse in rigidity, this moment of vulnerability, fosters a deeper, genuine connection that the hyper-regulated public sphere just cannot achieve.
It's like a societal reset button.
That's a perfect way to describe it. It allows individuals to recover from the intense pressure of war and reinforce social bonds without the mediation of formalities before they must once again step back into the rigid structure of the outside world.
The genius is that the release valve is itself highly ritualized and controlled. It doesn't lead to true anarchy, but rather a restorative experience. Okay, so now we make the cultural collision. The sharp turn from the order of explicit distance to the order of constant intentional negotiation found in high-context cultures, specifically across North African cities.
Right.
If Japan's order is based on making the individual invisible, this order seems to be based on making every individual hypervisible and interacting continuously.
The functional logic of order in places like the souk or the Medina is completely interaction-based. When Western observers look at, say, the main square in Marrakech, they see apparent disorder, a dense, noisy tangle of human activity.
I mean, that was my first impression. Chaos.
Because you look for static, rule-based systems like traffic lights or painted lanes, and when you don't find them, you assume chaos. But what you are actually seeing is an incredibly sophisticated, high-speed, human-centric negotiation system.
We catch this perfectly in the experience of Omar, the delivery driver. He's navigating an ancient Medina where the passageways are narrow, filled with everything from donkeys and handcarts to mopeds and hundreds of fast-moving pedestrians.
And Omar cannot rely on rules because the context shifts every 3 seconds. A shopkeeper might suddenly pull his wares out halfway across the lane, a wedding procession might turn a corner. His survival depends on hyper-awareness and connection, not on distance.
Okay, so his horn, which sounds aggressive to me, is something else entirely.
Functionally, it's a sonar ping. It is data transmission. It says, I am here, I am moving fast, adjust your trajectory. He relies on a rapid exchange of eye contact, micro-adjustments from cart pushers, and quick verbal exchanges to maintain flow.
So the noise isn't random clutter. The noise is essential data input. Everyone is not just paying attention to their own path, they're constantly anticipating and paying attention to everyone else's path.
Precisely. The order is a living, flexible algorithm. If the train tracks of Tokyo represent a linear, fixed algorithm that must be followed perfectly,
the Medina represents a dynamic, non-linear algorithm that requires constant real-time input and adjustment.
Exactly. This flexibility is the source of efficiency in high-density, community-centric cultures. It allows for the integration of unpredictable factors like a sudden delivery or a spontaneous gathering without gridlock, because the rules are always subject to immediate, on-the-spot negotiation.
And crucially, this system has to require a high level of relational trust and accountability. If you operate on the basis of constantly negotiating space, you have to trust that the other person will honor that negotiation in the next split second.
Absolutely. The system assumes social embeddedness. If you crash your moped or break a rule, the consequences are immediate and social. The shopkeepers know who you are, the community holds you accountable, and that relational cost is far more powerful than a traffic ticket.
This fluid negotiable order isn't just a quirk of traffic then. It's necessary for survival, especially given the vast scale of the informal economy.
It is.
We know that the informal economy employs over 50% of North Africa's labor force, acting as a crucial safety net and absorbing vast numbers of youth who might otherwise be unemployed.
So when formal structures are inadequate or overly bureaucratic, urban residents rely on what researchers call ephemeral social formations.
Ephemeral social formations, what does that mean?
They're flexible, tactical associations, alliances of convenience that are quickly put together and then dissolved. They allow residents to balance local solidarity and cohesion with the external opportunities required for economic livelihood. They are constantly moving among contradictory modalities, the secular and the spiritual, the formal and the informal, to achieve their goals.
Okay, let's delve into those incredible examples of non-traditional governance that defy formal categorization. The Municipal Governance Assembly in Mayo, Khartoum, seems to operate on perpetual process rather than a final decision.
Mayo is a brilliant case study in managing permanent flux. The site, it's repurposed from a former police station, is now an assembly space dedicated to perpetual legislative deliberation. And while the entrances are regulated to ensure only specific demographic groups are physically present based on ethnicity, religion, or age once inside, the governance process is continuous. And the critical finding here is that deliberation never leads to final resolutions or votes.
Wait, if they never vote or reach a final resolution, how does anything get done?
The efficiency comes from the continuous process of recognition and coexistence. People circulate, they argue about resources, they plan, they barter assistance, and they pray all side by side.
So the goal isn't consensus.
The process isn't about achieving consensus. It's about acknowledging every actor's presence and conviction. It's a mechanism for continuous adaptation, allowing diverse, sometimes conflicting actors to constantly outsmart the rigidity of formal authorities and seize new opportunities.
So the governance is the ongoing conversation itself.
It is the ongoing articulation of differing convictions in the same space, demanding a kind of recognized indifference to achieve functional movement.
That is fascinating governance as continuous process, not finite product. Okay, next, the example of Yopogan II, Abidjan, shows how social order can be established through a shared spiritual narrative, specifically during a funeral rite involving the nomadic sect. This seems incredibly high context.
It is. This is governance through emotional and spiritual implication. When a prominent academic died, the funeral rite was conducted by a local priest using a spiritual narrative that implicated everyone gathered.
Everyone, not just the family.
Not just the immediate family in the academic's death. This narrative mapped the causality of the death onto a pantheon of local spirits and, by extension, onto the ongoing conflicts within the community. The spiritual language served as a critical, non-political framework for addressing real social tensions.
So what was the practical governing outcome of this ritual?
The shared spiritual narrative forced a complex, intimate circulation of crucial social information and the making of unexpected alliances across traditional barriers. Since everyone was implicated, everyone had to participate. You saw important dignitaries making plans to support struggling street traders. You saw older adults taking seriously the ramblings of children. This process of being collectively responsible, even spiritually, created a temporary collapse of formal social distance.
It sounds like it allowed people to resituate themselves and explore new realignments for security and economic opportunity.
It did. It cultivated an outward-looking practice of remaking social ties that were necessary for urban livelihood. The ritual created a highly effective temporary government.
Finally, the tender negotiation in Thumbidyon Dakar. This is governance through pure, overwhelming, opportunistic dynamism in a race against the clock.
This illustrates the immense power of these relational webs against formal power. A large external company announced a housing estate project tender with an impossibly short overnight deadline.
The intent being to shut out local bidders.
Clearly, to keep the contract in-house. But the local community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of people, architects, politicians, spiritual leaders, community organizers, even local soccer clubs mobilized overnight.
And the tools they used were highly varied, defying any Western rulebook. Money, sorcery, political influence, and deep personal knowledge.
Exactly. They created intense, temporary constellations of alliances that cut across all existing political and social loyalties. People known to be rivals suddenly expressed willingness to collaborate on a single bid.
I see.
The sheer volume and complexity of the options and alliances presented by the morning, a torrent of bids created through this highly dynamic process, was so overwhelming and so defied the company's internal logic that they were forced to ask for more time and rethink the process.
So it demonstrates that governance in these contexts is fundamentally about maintaining spaces for diverse initiatives and building relational webs.
Right. It's not just providing formalized goods and services. The ability to assemble and mobilize quickly is the true source of power.
So if the underlying social order is fluid, relational, and negotiative, how must modern urban planning in African cities change to align with this reality, rather than just imposing a rigid Western distance-based model?
It requires a conscious, aggressive shift away from the business as usual scenario, the BAU scenario, which currently dominates planning.
And BAU is what? More highways.
BAU means continued investment in car-centric infrastructure, more urban flyovers, wider roads, and urban sprawl, which actually exacerbates congestion and undermines public transport viability. This is the imposition of a static, distant order onto a culture that operates dynamically.
The alternative is the high shift scenario, which actually embraces the density and the focus on human-scale movement we saw in the Medina.
The high shift is the policy formalization of the negotiated order. It demands aggressive investment in mass rapid transit systems, particularly bus rapid transit, or BRT, and crucially, a focus on non-motorized transport, NMT.
Making walking and cycling safe and convenient.
Exactly. And it requires compact urban planning to deliberately reduce trip length and promote walkability. It optimizes the city for human interaction and movement, not just car flow.
And the numbers supporting this shift are enormous. This isn't just a social choice, it's an economic necessity.
Financially and environmentally, the evidence is overwhelming. Compared to the BAU scenario, the high-shift approach is projected to reduce total urban infrastructure investment costs by over $2.14 trillion globally between now and 2050.
Wow, that's a staggering number.
It is, and furthermore, it mitigates over 5,000 million metric tons of CO2. When you build infrastructure that aligns with human-scale negotiation rather than car-centric distance, you save money and the environment.
So how do cities formalize that negotiation process we saw Omar using, making it palatable for modern policy? That's where travel demand management, or TDM, comes in, specifically parking reform.
TDM is how you translate the Medina's prioritization of people over vehicles into a modern regulatory framework. It's a way of using policy to manage and negotiate space. TDM policies prioritize pedestrians and public transport users by fundamentally rethinking parking.
How so?
They advocate for abolishing parking minimums in new developments and instead adopting parking maximums, especially along mass transit corridors.
So you're essentially limiting the space dedicated to private vehicles, which forces a negotiation for that scarce space.
Exactly. And the most direct negotiation tool is dynamic pricing. Parking fees must vary according to real-time demand. If you want to occupy prime, high-demand real estate all day, the cost should be prohibitive.
Which nudges private vehicle users toward public transport.
Right. It formalizes the cultural preference we observed, that mobility is optimized when it relies on shared high-capacity systems rather than individual low-capacity systems. TDM is regulation used to create a fluid, negotiated outcome, echoing the efficiency found in those dynamic relational webs.
Okay, so we have meticulously mapped two highly successful yet diametrically opposed cultural operating systems for order: the precise, silent distance of Japan and the dynamic, loud negotiation of North Africa.
Right.
Now, what happens when these different cultural clocks meet in the pressure cooker of global professional environments, like multinational corporations or international organizations?
This is where we see the high-stakes friction, which we often summarize as the clash of clocks. It reveals that when order systems collide, the conflict is often not about the goals, but about the fundamental process of how to achieve those goals.
The story of Lucas and Amira, two team leaders at an international NGO in Geneva, illustrates this perfectly. They were tasked with solving a rapid logistics crisis for a refugee camp, a truly high-stakes problem requiring immediate efficiency.
And Lucas, who operated on the structural order script, brought a German background rooted in precision and linearity. For him, efficiency meant adherence to the schedule.
The meeting starts at 9 a.m. sharp.
At 09.000000 precisely, following a strict linear agenda of bullet points. His framework dictated that punctuality and adherence to the formal rules were the fastest, most professional route to solving the crisis.
Amira, however, came from a North African background, where the social order script dictates that professionalism is defined by relational trust.
Right. So she arrived perhaps 10 minutes late, but spent the crucial first moments asking about the welfare of the field workers' families and the emotional alignment of the team.
And she saw Lucas's cold adherence to the clock and the agenda as reckless.
To her it was. You cannot solve a crisis, in her framework, until the human relationships and trust are secure.
So their conflict was really a proxy war over which cultural operating system was correct.
Lucas saw Amira as unprofessional and slow because she was violating the structural clock. Amira saw Lucas as inhumane and ineffective because he was violating the social clock.
But they were both striving for the same outcome.
Exactly, efficiency. But they were pursuing it through two fundamentally different routes. Lucas sought speed and precision via the written rule and the chronometer. Amira sought lasting effectiveness and precision via trust and relational alignment.
And the consequence is that the entire project stalls because they are actively undermining each other. It's not a lack of commitment, it's a failure to understand the other person's definition of order.
Absolutely. And this friction is a central challenge in global work today. The progressive response from international organizations is to move past seeing diversity simply in terms of visible markers like ethnicity or gender, and to actively recognize hyperdiversity.
Hyperdiversity.
Hyperdiversity includes vast differences in lifestyle, socioeconomic status, personal values, and critically, how people define efficient work. The goal shifts entirely from demanding assimilation to creating synergy.
So how do organizations operationalize this goal of synergy, moving beyond just lip service to genuinely integrating these conflicting operating systems? I understand they rely on specific analytical frameworks to diagnose the friction. Let's start with the cultural differences lens.
This lens, which is often rooted in classic cross-cultural research, focuses on national cultural values like power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and uncertainty avoidance. It provides a crucial warning. Management practices cannot be universalized. A structure that provides comfort and efficiency in a high uncertainty avoidance culture, like Japan, where rigid rules are expected and valued, will be seen as stifling and inflexible in a low uncertainty avoidance culture.
So if the headquarters imposes a universal policy for performance reviews, it might be interpreted completely differently in the field offices.
Precisely. In a culture that values direct feedback and low power distance, the manager might expect robust, immediate dissent. But in a high-context, high-powered distance culture, the subordinate will use elaborate tatame to avoid direct confrontation, making the manager believe they agree when they absolutely do not.
So the solution involves navigating that difficult organizational dilemma. Do we centralize procedures for consistency, or do we decentralize authority, allowing local cultural interpretations to take precedence?
It forces a hybrid approach, creating common goals but allowing for culturally relevant means of execution.
The second, and perhaps more sensitive framework, is the social differences lens. This moves beyond national culture and focuses on power dynamics and identity.
And this is critical because the friction is rarely neutral. This lens focuses on identities, race, gender, class, social status, and how they intersect with power and privilege. It often highlights the historical context of power imbalances, including colonial legacies that shape organizational dynamics.
So this framework helps organizations identify and dismantle unconscious schemas that undermine effective teamwork.
Yes.
Can you provide an example of how those unconscious schemas play out in a high-stakes environment like the Lucas and Amira scenario?
One study in international organizations found that during the formation of new multicultural teams, individuals a priori assessed colleagues who originated from Western or developed countries as inherently more competent and qualified, regardless of their actual track record or area of expertise.
Wow, just an automatic assumption.
An automatic assumption. Conversely, individuals from the global south were often perceived as less skilled or less decisive, even if they had superior local knowledge.
Which means someone like Amira, coming from a high-context social culture, faces a double friction. Not only is her definition of professional efficiency relationship first misunderstood, but her competence might be questioned simply based on her origin.
Exactly. Her social operating system is penalized. The social differences lens forces organizations to confront these power imbalances, ensuring that the critical local knowledge and unique perspectives brought by hyper-diverse staff are systematically utilized as a strategic asset rather than being driven underground by pressure to assimilate into the dominant cultural model.
So the core managerial challenge is ultimately to create a system, a hybrid framework, that can intentionally and systematically integrate Lucas's structural precision with Amira's relational trust.
That's the goal.
We started this deep dive asking a fundamental question. If two completely opposite systems for human organization, the silent, distant contract of Japan and the loud, negotiated dynamism of North Africa, can both function perfectly, what does order actually mean? Our journey has exposed the reality that order is simply the way a society chooses to handle the inevitable chaos of human coexistence.
We've seen the Japanese model create a logistical machine defined by the unspoken contract of wa, which ensures precision at the expense of creating immense individual psychological pressure.
And we contrasted that with the North African model, where constant negotiation, noise is essential data, and the rapid deployment of ephemeral social formations create a dynamic, living algorithm that prioritizes relational trust and fluid adaptation.
Right.
The fundamental insight seems to be that effective management, whether you are trying to govern a massive city or lead a multinational corporation, cannot rely on a single fixed set of rules. It requires developing a hybrid framework.
And this hybrid framework must be a process for integrating the best elements of both worlds. The structural precision derived from rules and metrics, combined with the relational trust and flexible adaptation derived from high-context interaction. By systematically utilizing the knowledge and perspective brought by hyperdiversity, we move past the concept of efficiency as uniformity and instead realize that multiple clocks ticking simultaneously can, in fact, achieve a superior, synergistic, and more resilient result.